My name is Stella, 33 years old, and in my family the golden son gets absolutely everything. My parents paid my older brother's rent, bought him a house, and cleared his massive debts while I scrubbed diner tables to pay my own way. But when he discovered at Christmas dinner that I had quietly built a $30 million software empire on my own, he collapsed to the floor crying. My mother demanded I hand over $18 million immediately because I had somehow stolen his future. I just smiled, pulled out my phone, and silently cut off the financial life support they did not even know I was providing. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. A crystal wine glass shattered against the dining room wall, ripping through the warm holiday air. Red wine splattered across the custom white silk wallpaper of my parents' Connecticut estate, dripping down like fresh blood. I did not flinch. I did not even reach for a napkin to wipe the drops that splashed onto my cashmere sweater. I simply sat at the grand mahogany table and watched the chaos erupt around me. My brother Bradley, the 36-year-old undisputed king of the household, was hyperventilating on the imported Persian rug. Clutching a crumpled wine-stained copy of the latest Forbes Tech magazine, he pointed a shaking finger straight at my face. His chest heaved as he struggled for air. His face flushed a dangerous shade of crimson. "You hid a $30 million company from us!" Bradley screamed, his voice cracking with sheer panic. "You built that entire supply chain logistics platform behind my back, sold a portion to venture capitalists, and kept it a secret. My startup is drowning. I owe my private equity investors $18 million by the end of the quarter, or I am going to prison. You have to save me. I am your brother." Before I could even process the absurdity of a grown man throwing a temper tantrum on Christmas Eve, my mother, Patricia, slammed her hands on the table. She knocked over a silver gravy boat, glaring at me with eyes so full of venom you would think I had just committed treason. "You stole his future!" Patricia shrieked, her perfectly styled blonde hair shaking as she lunged toward me. She grabbed the collar of my coat from the back of my chair. "You watched your brother struggle to keep his startup afloat for 3 years. You sit there with millions in the bank while your own flesh and blood is facing bankruptcy. Write him a check for $18 million right now, Stella. Right this second." I pulled my coat away from her grip. I looked my mother dead in the eye, keeping my voice dangerously level. "Stole his future?" I asked softly. "You remortgaged this house twice to pay off his gambling debts. You bought him a luxury loft downtown while I was working double shifts at a diner to pay my college tuition. You gave him everything. I built my company from absolutely nothing." My father, Richard, finally entered the fray. He stood up from his chair at the head of the table, his face a mask of furious authority. He slammed his fist down on the mahogany wood so hard the remaining crystal glasses rattled. "I told you to drop that stupid logistics hobby 5 years ago," Richard roared. "I told you that software development was a man's game and that you were embarrassing the family by trying to play CEO. I told you to go work as your brother's executive assistant. You owe him your success, Stella. You are going to sign over 60% of your shares to Bradley immediately. He is the eldest son. It is his right." The sheer delusion in the room was suffocating. My father actually believed that because Bradley was a male, he was retroactively entitled to the intellectual property I had spent 80-hour weeks coding. I had starved for my success, facing endless rejections from investors who looked right past me. I survived on pure grit, while Bradley used his endless allowance to play pretend businessman with his wealthy country club friends. Then came the final voice of entitlement. My sister-in-law Jasmine stepped forward. She was a beautiful African-American lifestyle influencer who had married Bradley under the illusion that he was a wealthy tech mogul. She crossed her arms over her chest, purposefully flashing the $20,000 Rolex watch my parents had just bought her for Christmas. "Stella, be reasonable," Jasmine said, her voice dripping with toxic sweetness. "You cannot be this selfish. Bradley is the head of the next generation. We have a child on the way. We need that capital to maintain our brand and keep the family legacy intact. You are a single woman. What could you possibly need $30 million for hand over the 60% share? It is your duty to this family. Duty. The word hung in the air heavy and suffocating. They spoke of duty while standing in a house I was secretly keeping out of foreclosure. They demanded $18 million without realizing that the only reason they had a roof over their heads and a commercial office for Bradley's fake business was purely me. I did not yell. I absolutely did not cry. I did not even try to defend my right to keep the money I had bled for. I simply sat back in my chair, picked up my phone from the table, and unlocked the screen. They watched me, expecting me to open my banking app and transfer the funds. Instead, I opened a direct message to my wealth manager. I typed a single command, hitting send without a second thought. The financial life support was officially terminated. The silence in the dining room stretched tight like a piano wire about to snap. Bradley stared at my hands with wide, feverish eyes. He was waiting for the familiar chime of a banking notification. He wiped the sweat from his forehead, leaving a smear of spilled wine across his pale skin. He actually believed my silence was submission. He genuinely thought that after 33 years of being treated like the dirt beneath his custom Italian loafers, I was just going to casually wire $18 million to save his fraudulent lifestyle. "Did you do it?" Bradley demanded. His voice was high and reedy, sounding nothing like the arrogant tech visionary he pretended to be on podcasts. "Did you send the wire transfer?" I placed my phone face down on the mahogany table. The screen went dark. I looked at him and offered a slow, deliberate smile. "No, Bradley. I did not." The air vanished from the room. Bradley let out a sound that was half gasp and half shriek. He scrambled backward against the wall, knocking over a heavy silver candlestick. It clattered loudly against the hardwood floor, but nobody moved to pick it up. "You are lying," Bradley yelled. He began tearing at the collar of his expensive silk shirt as if it were choking him. "You have to send it. I am facing federal charges. The investors will destroy me. They will take everything. I will not survive in prison, Stella. I will end it all. I swear to God I will just end my life tonight, and my blood will be entirely on your hands." It was his classic move, the ultimate manipulation tactic he had weaponized since we were teenagers. Whenever Bradley failed, whenever he caused a disaster, he threatened to harm himself so our parents would panic and shield him from the consequences. Patricia reacted exactly as programmed. My mother let out a guttural sob and threw herself between me and the dining room door, blocking my only exit. Her face was contorted into a mask of pure maternal terror and rage. She reached out with clawed hands and grabbed the lapels of my heavy winter coat hanging over the back of my chair. She yanked it upward, shaking the heavy wool fabric directly in my face. "Look what you are doing to him!" Patricia screamed, her voice echoing painfully off the vaulted ceilings. "You are murdering your own brother. You stole his future. You sat there hoarding millions of dollars, keeping your little tech company a dark secret while he struggled. You watched him drown, and you did absolutely nothing. You stole the success that belonged to him." I stood up slowly, pushing my chair back with a harsh scrape against the floor. I did not raise my voice, but the sheer force of my anger made the air temperature drop. I reached out and violently ripped my coat from her manicured grip. She stumbled backwards, stunned by my physical resistance. "Stole his future," I asked, my words dropping like anvils onto the dining room table. "Are you actually insane? You remortgaged this exact house twice to pay off his underground sports gambling debts. You drained my college tuition fund to buy him cars and fund his fake startup ventures, while you two were writing him blank checks to throw away on poker games and bad investments. I was working night shifts at a diner just to pay for my own textbooks. I built a $30 million software empire between midnight and 4 in the morning because my own parents cut me off financially to feed his delusions." Jasmine shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her eyes narrowing as she looked at her husband. "Gambling debts?" Jasmine asked sharply. "Bradley, you told me your parents bought this house with cash and that your early funding came from legitimate angel investors. What gambling debts?" Bradley ignored his wife completely, keeping his frantic eyes pinned on me. He was rocking back and forth on the floor, a grown man reduced to a petulant toddler throwing a tantrum because his sister finally refused to be his human shield. Richard stepped in front of Patricia, puffing out his chest to regain control of his crumbling kingdom. My father had always used intimidation to crush any rebellion in his house. His face was purple with indignation, and the veins in his neck bulged against his tightly knotted silk tie. "Do not you dare speak to your mother that way!" Richard bellowed, pointing a thick finger inches from my nose. "You are a selfish, ungrateful disgrace to the Wilson name. We gave you life. We raised you in luxury. If you walk out that door without transferring those funds to your brother, I will make sure you regret it for the rest of your miserable life. I will publicly disown you. I will call every media contact I have and drag your name through the press. I will tell the world exactly how you abandoned your family in our darkest hour. Your corporate board will fire you by morning when they see what a heartless monster you truly are." He stood there, breathing heavily, expecting me to cower. He expected the teenage girl who used to beg for his approval to resurface and apologize. He expected me to write the check just to keep the fragile peace of our toxic family intact. I slipped my arms slowly into my coat. I smoothed the fabric, unbothered by his screaming. I picked up my purse and slung it over my shoulder. I looked at my weeping brother, my hysterical mother, my confused sister-in-law, and my blustering father. "Keep that threat," I said, my voice echoing with icy authority. "Call the press. Call your country club friends. Disown me loudly and proudly. Because tomorrow when the sun comes up and the real world comes crashing through your front door, you will beg me to pretend we are closely related." The bitter wind of the Connecticut winter whipped against my face as I walked down my parents' perfectly manicured driveway. I did not look back at the grand colonial house. The heavy oak front door slammed shut behind me, a final punctuation mark on 33 years of emotional extortion. I climbed into the back of my waiting town car. The driver pulled away from the curb, leaving the screaming matches and shattered crystal glasses far behind. The hour-long drive back to the city was silent. I needed that silence. I watched the suburban darkness shift into the blazing electric skyline of my actual life. The town car glided to a halt in front of my downtown high-rise. I rode the private elevator up to my penthouse. The doors opened directly into my living room. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered an unobstructed view of the glittering city below. The space was expansive and quiet. There was no mahogany furniture stained with spilled wine. There were no screaming relatives demanding a piece of my soul. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water from the kitchen island and walked straight to my home office. The polished concrete floors echoed beneath my boots. I sat down at my massive glass desk and woke up my primary monitor. The screen illuminated the dark room. My mother had accused me of watching my brother drown. She claimed I hoarded my wealth in secret while they suffered. The sheer spectacular irony of her accusation made a cold laugh escape my throat. I typed my master password into the encrypted server. A network of offshore and domestic accounts bloomed across the monitor. I clicked open the primary folder for Apex Holdings. Apex Holdings was a discreet, limited liability company I established 3 years ago. Nobody in my family knew it belonged to me. To them, it was just a faceless corporate entity, a stroke of incredibly good luck that had miraculously saved them from absolute ruin. I pulled up the automated ledger. Line item 1 was the mortgage on my parents' Connecticut estate. 3 years ago, Richard and Patricia had quietly slipped into severe default. They had leveraged every ounce of equity in that house to fund Bradley and his endless series of failed business ventures. The bank had been weeks away from putting a foreclosure notice on their front door. I could not let my parents end up on the street. So I had Apex Holdings purchase the debt. Every single month for 36 months, my company had quietly covered their massive mortgage payments. They thought their bank had simply restructured their loan out of goodwill. They thought their country club prestige had saved them. I scrolled down to line item 2, Bradley and his spectacular downtown commercial lease. My brother loved playing the role of a successful tech entrepreneur. He loved the glass walls, the espresso machines, and the prestige of a prime zip code. But his company produced nothing but debt. His investors had stopped answering his calls years ago. I clicked open a subfolder labeled 2023 Bankruptcy Intervention. 2 years ago, Bradley had crashed his previous startup straight into a brick wall of federal tax liens and creditor lawsuits. He had been facing personal bankruptcy and potential fraud charges. Richard had proudly announced to the entire extended family that he had liquidated his own retirement accounts to bail his golden son out of trouble. Richard took all the credit. He paraded around like the ultimate patriarch saving his boy. I stared at the scanned bank transfer receipts on my screen. Richard never had the money. His accounts were completely empty at the time. It was me. I was the one who authorized a silent wire transfer of $400,000 through Apex Holdings to satisfy the creditors. I paid his debts. I kept him out of a courtroom. I bought him that prime commercial office space so he could maintain his pathetic illusion of success. And how did he repay me? By demanding $18 million and threatening to destroy my name. My family demanded that I surrender 60% of my life work for the sake of our legacy. They wanted to strip me down to nothing so the golden child could continue playing a billionaire on social media. They called me selfish. They called me a thief. They threatened to drag my reputation through the mud if I did not hand over everything I had built with my own bare hands. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair and stared at the glowing numbers. The total amount of money I had secretly funneled into keeping my toxic family afloat was staggering. I had been paying for my own abuse. I had been funding the very people who despised me. My father wanted to play hardball. He wanted to see what happened when the real world came crashing through his front door. I decided it was time to grant his wish. I picked up my cell phone from the glass desk. I dialed the direct emergency line for my primary wealth manager. The line rang exactly twice before he answered. It was late on Christmas Eve, but he knew I never called unless it was absolutely critical. "Good evening, Cassidy," he said, his voice sharp and alert. "How can I assist you tonight?" I did not hesitate. I looked at the mortgage payments, the commercial lease transfers, and the bottomless pit of my family and their financial entitlement. "Halt all automated payments from Apex Holdings," I said, my voice perfectly steady. "Cancel the residential mortgage coverage in Connecticut. Terminate the commercial lease payments for the downtown office space. Stop every single outgoing transfer immediately." My wealth manager paused for a single fraction of a second. "Understood, Cassidy," he replied. "When would you like this suspension to take effect?" I watched the clock on my monitor ticking toward midnight. "Effective at midnight," I said. "Cut them off completely." The morning after Christmas was bitterly cold. Sunlight reflected sharply off my corporate headquarters. I stood by my office windows watching the city wake up. My phone had been ringing continuously. My wealth manager executed my orders precisely at midnight. Every single automated payment from Apex Holdings had been permanently canceled. The financial lifeline that had kept my parents and brother floating in unearned luxury was officially dead. I knew it would take days for the banks to process the missed payments and issue default notices, which meant my family was completely oblivious to their impending ruin. They still believed they held all the power. They still believed I was just a rebellious daughter throwing a temper tantrum. Down in my marble lobby, that delusion was about a second away from becoming a public spectacle. My head of security radioed my office, his voice tight with professional restraint. He informed me that 2 aggressive men claiming to be my father and brother had just stormed through the revolving doors. They were currently harassing the front desk staff and refusing to leave. I watched the security feed on my tablet. Richard and Bradley looked completely out of place in my sleek, modern lobby. They were wearing their typical country club attire, acting as though they owned the very floor tiles they walked on. They were shouting, pointing fingers, and making an absolute scene. I told security to hold their ground, but not physically remove them just yet. I wanted to see exactly how far they were willing to go. I took the private elevator down to the mezzanine level overlooking the lobby and observed the chaos below. Bradley slammed his hand against the polished granite of the reception desk. He leaned over, trying to intimidate the young woman working there. He yelled that he did not need an appointment to see the little girl playing executive. He demanded she print him a visitor badge immediately and escort him to the executive floor. When the receptionist firmly reiterated that she could not grant access without my direct authorization, Richard stepped up. My father puffed out his chest using the same booming voice he used to terrorize waitstaff. He announced he was Richard Wilson, the patriarch of the family, and had the authority to fire anyone who disrespected him. The receptionist trained to handle irate corporate clients remained perfectly composed. She pressed the silent alarm under her desk. Within seconds, 4 large security guards formed a solid wall between my family and the turnstiles. Bradley scoffed at the guards, his arrogance reaching a fever pitch. He loudly proclaimed to the entire lobby that he practically funded this operation. He shouted that without his initial investment, my company would not even exist. He was referring to the $5,000 he had handed me during my sophomore year of college. It was guilt money given to me after my father drained my college savings account to purchase Bradley a brand new luxury vehicle for his 21st birthday. I used that $5,000 to buy a used laptop and keep myself from starving while I coded my software in a damp basement apartment. Bradley genuinely believed that tiny sum made him a founding partner. Richard pointed at the head security guard and demanded they step aside. He claimed that because he raised me, he was legally entitled to inspect my business operations. The absolute audacity of his statement echoed through the lobby. He had never once asked about my business plan. He had never once asked to see my office. He spent 5 years telling his golf buddies that I was a stubborn spinster wasting my life on a silly internet project. Now that he knew my company was valued at $30 million, he suddenly wanted to play the proud, involved father. Bradley tried to physically push past the largest security guard. The guard simply shifted his weight, sending Bradley stumbling backward in his loafers. Bradley lost his balance and nearly fell onto the floor. His face turned bright red with humiliation and fury. He began screaming threats, declaring his lawyers would shut this entire building down by the end of the day. He yelled that I was a thief, a fraud, and a terrible sister who stole his brilliant ideas. The sheer volume of his lies caused several employees waiting for coffee to stop and stare. The scene was perfectly pathetic. 2 grown men throwing a public tantrum because they realized they could no longer control the woman they had spent decades diminishing. I decided the show had gone on long enough. I walked over to the grand glass staircase and slowly descended into the lobby. The sharp click of my heels on the steps cut through Bradley shouting. My father and brother froze as they saw me approaching. I was wearing a sharply tailored designer suit, my hair perfectly sleek, holding a fresh cup of coffee. I did not look like the exhausted, desperate girl they remembered. I looked exactly like the chief executive officer of a highly successful tech enterprise. I stopped a few feet away from the security barricade. Richard immediately opened his mouth to start making demands, but I raised a single hand, silencing him instantly. I looked at the head of security and gave a brief nod. "Stand down," I said smoothly. "It is fine. Let them through." The guards parted seamlessly, creating a clear path. Bradley smirked, adjusting his jacket, clearly believing his intimidation tactics had worked. Richard gave me a smug, triumphant look, assuming I had folded under the pressure of public embarrassment. They thought I was surrendering. I turned around and swiped my access card at the turnstile. "Follow me," I said without looking back. "Let us go up to the executive boardroom. We have a lot to discuss." They then followed me onto the private elevator, completely unaware that they were walking straight into a trap from which they would never recover. The private elevator ascended to the 42nd floor in suffocating silence. I stood near the glass panel, watching the city drop away beneath us while Richard and Bradley shifted uncomfortably behind me. When the doors parted, they stepped out into the nerve center of my operations. Analysts walked briskly through the corridors. Nobody paid my father or brother any attention. They were completely stripped of their suburban country club armor. The room was designed for corporate warfare. A massive slab of black marble served as the conference table. I took my seat at the head of the table. I did not offer them anything to drink. I merely folded my hands, resting them on the cool marble, and waited. Richard, realizing he was losing the psychological high ground, grabbed the back of the nearest chair and yanked it out. He sat down heavily, trying to project an air of absolute authority. Bradley remained standing, pacing like a caged animal. He kept glancing at the digital stock tickers. The reality of my wealth was starting to short-circuit his brain. "Let us drop the theatrics, Cassidy," my father barked, using my given name for the first time in years. "You have had your fun parading us around your office. You want to play the corporate boss. Fine. But business is business and family is family. We are here to finalize the transition of assets." He reached inside the breast pocket of his tailored jacket and pulled out a folded sheaf of papers. He threw them onto the black marble. They slid across the polished surface, stopping exactly inches from my hands. I looked down at the documents. It was a fabricated, backdated investment contract. It looked like it had been hastily printed at a local shipping store 20 minutes before they barged into my lobby. Bradley stopped pacing and slammed his hands down on the table, leaning toward me with a triumphant sneer. "You thought you were so clever keeping this company a secret from us," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "You thought you could build a $30 million empire and leave your own brother twisting in the wind. But you forgot one very important detail about how startups work. You forgot about your seed investors." I stared at him, letting the silence stretch out. "What seed investors, Bradley?" I asked, my tone dangerously flat. "Me," he shouted, pointing a thumb at his own chest. "I am your initial investor. This contract proves that my initial financial contribution entitles me to a 50% equity stake in this company. At a $30 million valuation, you owe me $15 million. I expect the shares transferred to my name by the end of the business day. If you sign right now, we might even let you keep your title for the optics." I looked from the fake contract to Bradley and then to Richard, who was nodding in solemn agreement, as if this were a reasonable corporate negotiation. The absolute delusion required to walk into my building, slap a forged document on my table, and demand half of everything I owned was staggering. They had spent my entire life taking from me, and now they believed they possessed a legal right to steal my future. I picked up the document. I read the first paragraph. I let out a sharp, genuine laugh. The sound bounced off the glass walls of the boardroom, completely shattering the tense atmosphere. I tossed the papers back across the marble table. They fluttered and landed near Richard's elbow. "An investment contract," I said, still laughing. "You are calling that $5,000 seed money." "It was early-stage capital," Bradley insisted, his face reddening. "You were broke. You needed funding. I provided it. That makes me a co-founder." "You mean the $5,000 you threw at me after Dad drained my $40,000 college fund to buy you a brand new BMW for your 21st birthday?" I asked, leaning forward. The temperature in the room plummeted. "That was not an investment, Bradley. That was guilt money. You watched Richard empty the savings account I had worked for since I was 15 years old, just so you could drive a luxury car you did not earn. You handed me $5,000 in cash because you felt pathetic, and you knew I was about to drop out of school because I could not afford my tuition. You did not even know what a software platform was back then." Richard slammed his fist on the table. "Do not rewrite history, Cassidy. We made a family decision regarding those funds. Your brother needed reliable transportation for his internships. You were just taking basic classes. He invested in your future, and now you are going to pay him his legal share." "There is no legal share," I replied, my voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "This document is a complete forgery. It is not notarized. It is not filed with any state registry. It is a piece of trash you printed out this morning because you are desperate and terrified. You cut off your own legs to fund his gambling and his failures, and now you want to harvest my organs to stay alive." Bradley slowly straightened up, pulling his jacket tight. He looked down at me with a cold, calculating sneer that stripped away any remaining illusion that we were still a family. He was a desperate, cornered rat, and he was finally baring his teeth. "You can laugh all you want," Cassidy, Bradley said, his voice shaking with malicious excitement. "You can sit there and mock us. You can pretend you hold all the cards. But you are not as smart as you think you are. My lawyer is already at the courthouse. He is filing an emergency injunction to freeze every single corporate asset tied to your company and Apex Holdings. Your accounts will be locked by noon. The heavy glass doors of the boardroom swung open with a soft pneumatic hiss, cutting off Bradley mid-rant. Footsteps clicked against the polished concrete, steady and unhurried. Both Richard and Bradley snapped their heads toward the entrance. I did not even blink. I knew exactly who it was. Cameron, my lead corporate attorney, walked into the room carrying a slim leather briefcase. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit and an expression of absolute terrifying calm. Cameron was a legal shark, a man who dismantled Fortune 500 companies before his morning coffee. He glided over to the black marble table and took his place standing directly to my right. Bradley sneered, puffing out his chest to mask the sudden uncertainty flashing in his eyes. "You can bring in all the expensive suits you want," Cassidy Bradley spat, leaning forward. "My lawyer is already at the courthouse. Your little empire is going to be frozen solid in less than an hour." Cameron did not sit down. He did not introduce himself. He simply placed his leather briefcase on the marble surface and snapped the brass locks open. The sharp clicks echoed in the quiet room. "Your representation, a Mr. Thomas Vance, is currently sitting in the lobby of the federal courthouse," Cameron said, his voice smooth and deadly low. "He is not filing an injunction, Bradley. He is sitting there because I called him 15 minutes ago and informed him that if he submitted that fabricated document to a federal judge, I would personally see him disbarred by Friday." Bradley opened his mouth to shout, but the words died in his throat. Richard stepped forward, his face flushing a dangerous shade of crimson. "You cannot threaten us," Richard bellowed, slamming his hand onto the table. "We have a legally binding contract. My son is a 50% shareholder." Cameron withdrew a single sheet of paper from his briefcase. He held it up. It was a copy of the fake contract Bradley had just thrown at me. "This is not a contract," Richard Cameron stated, enunciating every syllable with chilling precision. "This is a felony. Under federal law, presenting a forged document with the intent to claim corporate assets constitutes wire fraud and attempted extortion. The penalty for these offenses includes significant federal prison time." Your lawyer realized this the moment I pointed out that the corporate entity named on this document, Apex Holdings, did not exist at the time of the alleged $5,000 transfer. You backdated a contract to a company that had not yet been incorporated. It is remarkably sloppy work. The color drained from Bradley and his pale face. He looked at Richard, panic setting in. Richard worked his jaw furiously, but for the first time in his life he had absolutely nothing to say. The bluster was gone, replaced by the creeping realization that they had walked into a legal slaughterhouse. But Cameron was not finished. He reached into his briefcase again. He pulled out 3 thick bound folders and dropped them onto the black marble table. The heavy thud made Bradley flinch. "This latest attempt at fraud is entirely consistent with your documented history," Cameron said, sliding the first folder toward Bradley. "Here we have the bankruptcy filings from your previous venture. We pulled the unsealed records. You claimed $3 million in legitimate operating expenses. Our forensic accountants found that over 80% of those funds were diverted to offshore gambling accounts and luxury vehicle leases." Cameron slid the second folder across the smooth stone. "Here we have the corporate filings from your logistics startup." Cameron continued, his voice devoid of any emotion. "You presented fabricated user metrics to secure your initial funding round. You lied to your investors. When the company collapsed, you threatened self-harm to force your father to buy out the angry creditors." Richard stared at the folders, his eyes wide. "You have no right to access those records," Richard sputtered, his voice losing its booming authority. "Those are sealed family matters. They are corporate fraud," Richard Cameron corrected sharply. "And because Apex Holdings, which Cassidy solely controls, stepped in to pay those creditors to keep your son out of a federal penitentiary, we have absolute legal access to every single financial document related to those transactions. You thought you were protecting a brilliant entrepreneur. In reality, you were harboring a financial parasite." Cameron slid the third and final folder into the center of the table, And this, Cameron said, tapping the heavy file with his index finger, is the complete ledger of your underwater mortgage on the Connecticut estate. It details every single payment Apex Holdings made to stop the bank from seizing your home. You came into this building today demanding $15 million from the very woman who has been secretly keeping a roof over your head. If you attempt to pursue this ridiculous extortion claim, I will submit all 3 of these folders to the district attorney. Bradley will face multiple counts of fraud, and Richard, you will be named as a co-conspirator for knowingly facilitating his financial crimes. The boardroom was silent. The air felt suffocating. The reality had crashed down upon them. They had no leverage or power. They were at my mercy, and I had none left. His face contorted with a mixture of profound humiliation and explosive rage. He realized he had been outplayed, outsmarted, and outfunded by the daughter he had spent 33 years calling worthless. He turned his furious glare toward Bradley. The golden sun was trembling, staring at the folders as if they were venomous snakes. "Get up," Richard hissed, grabbing Bradley by the arm of his expensive suit. Bradley stumbled, nearly tripping over his own feet, as his father yanked him toward the heavy glass doors. "You will have nothing by the time we are done with you," Richard shouted as they exited. Cameron turned to me. "Should we accelerate the eviction notices?" I nodded slowly. 2 weeks evaporated without a word from my father or brother. They were sitting in their estate, counting down the days until their imaginary injunction materialized to freeze my assets. Instead, the only legal machinery moving forward was the eviction protocol Cameron filed the moment they left my boardroom. I monitored the situation from my penthouse, watching the dominoes align perfectly. On a crisp Tuesday morning, my sister-in-law Jasmine was busy maintaining the illusion of her flawless life. She sat in the center of Bradley's lavish downtown corner office, bathed in the glow of a professional ring light. The floor-to-ceiling glass windows behind her offered a panoramic view of the city skyline, providing the perfect backdrop for her luxury lifestyle brand. She was broadcasting live on Instagram to over 300,000 followers, applying contour cream while chatting about his tech empire. Jasmine smiled at the camera, tossing her hair over her shoulder. She told her viewers that building a dynasty took immense dedication and that she was broadcasting straight from the epicenter of Bradley's success. She panned her smartphone around the room, making sure to capture the custom leather furniture, the imported espresso bar, and the sleek minimalist decor. She bragged about the sheer square footage of the executive suite, attributing it all to Bradley's unparalleled genius in the software industry. She had absolutely no idea that every square inch of that glass and steel sanctuary was funded by my sweat and my capital. She did not know that the chair she was sitting on, the light illuminating her face, and the very internet connection broadcasting her lies were all paid for by Apex Holdings. Just as Jasmine leaned into the camera to demonstrate a blending technique, the heavy double doors of the executive suite swung open. She did not look up, assuming it was Bradley returning from his morning coffee run. She casually mentioned to her live audience that the genius himself had arrived, but it was not Bradley. 2 uniformed county sheriffs walked into the frame. They were accompanied by a building management representative holding a thick stack of legal documents and a heavy ring of steel padlocks. The live feed captured everything in real time. Hundreds of thousands of viewers watched as the lead sheriff, a tall man with a stern expression, stepped directly into the glow of the ring light. "Ma'am," the sheriff announced, his voice carrying clearly over the live broadcast. "You need to vacate the premises immediately. This property is being seized under a court-ordered commercial eviction." Jasmine froze. The blending sponge dropped from her hand and bounced off the pristine white desk. She stared at the officers, her perfectly contoured face contorting in genuine confusion. She forced a nervous laugh, glancing at her phone screen, where the comments were suddenly moving at light speed. "Excuse me," Jasmine said, her voice trembling slightly as she tried to maintain her influencer persona. "You must have the wrong office. My husband is the CEO. This is a multi-million-dollar company. We are in the middle of a live broadcast." The building manager stepped forward, holding up the eviction notice. "There is no mistake, Mrs. Wilson. Apex Holdings terminated the lease agreement 2 weeks ago due to non-payment. You have 30 minutes to gather your personal belongings before we padlock the doors." Anything left inside will be seized to cover the outstanding debts. The chat on Jasmine's live feed exploded. Thousands of comments poured in simultaneously, mocking her, questioning the eviction and screen recording the ultimate humiliation. She scrambled to snatch the phone off its tripod, her manicured fingers slipping in her panic. She fumbled with the screen, frantically trying to end the broadcast, but the damage was permanently done. The internet is forever, and her facade of billionaire wife was actively burning down in front of a massive audience. Bradley sprinted into the office just as Jasmine finally managed to kill the live feed. He was out of breath, holding two iced coffees that immediately slipped from his grasp and splashed across the expensive hardwood floor. He stared at the sheriff's, the eviction notice, and the padlocks. "What are you doing?" Bradley yelled, his voice cracking with sheer panic. "You cannot do this. I have an angel investor. Apex Holdings handles all the logistics. Call them right now. There has to be a banking error." The building manager looked at him with zero sympathy. "Apex Holdings did not make a banking error, Mr. Wilson. They officially dissolved their relationship with your entity. They explicitly authorized this eviction. We have the signed affidavits from their legal team right here." Bradley lunged for his desk, ignoring the spilled coffee soaking into his Italian leather shoes. He grabbed his cell phone and frantically dialed the private number for his contact at Apex Holdings. He pressed the phone to his ear, his hands shaking violently. He waited for the familiar voice of his financial savior. Instead, the automated, disconnected tone echoed loudly in the quiet room. He dropped the phone. The brutal realization hit him. He pulled open the bottom drawer of his desk and dragged out a heavy binder filled with 3 years of banking statements. For 36 months, every rent payment, every utility bill, every vendor invoice had been covered by Apex Holdings. He had never put a single solitary dime of his own money into the business he claimed to have built from the ground up. He had not actually paid for a single thing. He was a complete fraud, existing purely on the silent charity of the sister he despised. Jasmine marched around the desk. The humiliation of being evicted, live on the internet, morphed into absolute rage. She pointed a finger at the thick binder. "Give me that. I want to see the accounting books right now." Bradley slammed the drawer shut. He threw his body weight over the keyboard, physically blocking her from the computer screen. Jasmine ripped her arm away from Bradley, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the sleeve of his tailored suit in a desperate attempt to break free. She did not need to see the computer screen to understand the magnitude of his deception. The county sheriffs were already moving past them, snapping heavy brass padlocks onto the glass conference room doors. The live stream had cut to black, but the digital shockwave was already tearing through our family ecosystem. I sat in my penthouse office watching the recorded clips multiply across social media platforms. Bradley was completely ruined. His entire identity, built on the illusion of being a self-made tech visionary, had just been publicly dismantled by the very county officials he thought he could buy off. He was being frog-marched out of a building he never actually owned, carrying nothing but a cardboard box of desk toys. But the eviction was merely the opening salvo. The real devastation was moving quietly through the banking system, targeting the false foundation of my parents' luxurious suburban lifestyle. Cameron had meticulously and perfectly timed the sudden corporate asset freeze. When Apex Holdings pulled its financial life support, the automated mortgage payments keeping the Connecticut estate afloat immediately bounced. The bank, already extremely nervous about Richard's leveraged debts and Bradley's sudden corporate implosion, wasted absolutely no time. They swiftly flagged the massive underwater mortgage for immediate default. My parents had spent 3 years living in a sprawling mansion they could not afford, hosting country club dinners, and bragging about their golden son, completely oblivious to the fact that my silent corporate entity was the only thing keeping the bank from seizing their marble driveway. The illusion of their wealth had a hard expiration date, and the clock had finally run out. My private cell phone vibrated violently against the polished mahogany surface of my massive executive desk. The caller identification displayed my mother's name. I let it ring 3 times, savoring the profound shift in power before pressing the answer button. Patricia did not bother with a greeting. Her voice came through the speaker in a shrill, hysterical pitch, completely devoid of her usual country club restraint. She was hyperventilating, her words tumbling over each other in a frantic rush of panic and misplaced outrage. She shrieked that a man in a cheap suit had just walked directly up their driveway and handed her father a thick envelope. She sobbed violently, claiming that the terrible economy and a malicious banking error had resulted in a foreclosure notice being taped to their front door. She refused to acknowledge that Richard had mismanaged their finances for a decade. She blamed the current administration, the volatile stock market, and greedy loan officers. Patricia painted a desperate picture of an innocent family being unjustly targeted by a broken financial system. She demanded that I stop whatever silly little project I was working on and listen to her. She insisted that family always drops everything during a crisis. She was laying the groundwork for her ultimate demand. Cassidy, you have to wire us $200,000, right? This second. Patricia commanded, her tears instantly drying up, replaced by the sharp, entitled tone she had used to manage my life since childhood. She spoke as if ordering a simple coffee, completely detached from the reality of the sum she was demanding. She insisted that I must have some money saved up from my internet job and that I could clear out my retirement accounts to handle the bank draft. When I remained absolutely silent, letting her demands echo in the quiet space of my office, Patricia shifted tactics. She immediately deployed the heavy artillery of emotional blackmail. She wailed that Richard's blood pressure was dangerously high and that the stress of losing their home might cause him to have a fatal heart attack. She reminded me of every meal I had ever eaten under their roof, calculating the cost of my childhood upbringing as a debt I was now legally obligated to repay. When I still did not answer, her voice grew feral and jagged. "You owe us this money, Cassidy!" Patricia screamed, the sound distorting through the phone speaker. "I sold my mother's heirloom diamonds to keep your brother afloat. I gave up my own family legacy just so Bradley could secure his seed funding. We sacrificed everything for his genius. It is your turn to bleed for this family. You have to fix this right now." The sheer audacity of her statement settled over me like a heavy winter chill. She had pawned her own mother's priceless diamonds to fund Bradley's gambling addictions and failed business ventures, calling it seed funding. She had watched my father drain my college savings to buy Bradley a luxury car, and she still considered herself a martyr. They had systematically cannibalized every asset they could touch to prop up a golden son who had never succeeded at anything in his entire life. And now, standing on the edge of total financial ruin, facing the immediate loss of her sprawling Connecticut estate, she expected me to offer up my own veins to keep their delusion alive. She genuinely believed my purpose on this earth was to serve as a designated donor for their reckless consumption. I looked at the financial dossiers spread across my desk, the ledgers showing millions of dollars I had secretly paid to keep them out of prison and off the streets. They had taken my capital, slapped Bradley's name on it, and paraded it around their social circles as proof of his superiority. The blinding reality of their narcissistic entitlement was staggering. I leaned toward the phone, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm, absolute zero. "I did bleed," I replied coldly, cutting through her frantic sobbing. "You just drank it without asking whose it was." I ended the call, set the mobile device face down on the marble, and permanently blocked her number from my phone. My phone had barely settled on the marble desk after blocking that number when the private penthouse intercom buzzed. I pressed the communication button, expecting my security team to report another pathetic attempt by my father to breach the building. Instead, the concierge came through, crisp and professional, informing me that Jasmine Wilson was waiting in the lobby. I anticipated a screaming match. I assumed Bradley had sent his wife as a glamorous attack dog to guilt me into unlocking the corporate accounts. I authorized her access out of pure morbid curiosity. 2 minutes later, the private elevator doors parted directly into my foyer. Jasmine stepped out, but she did not look like a woman preparing for a hysterical confrontation. The panic she displayed during the live broadcast eviction was completely gone. She wore a sharp tailored trench coat and oversized sunglasses, which she calmly removed and slipped into her designer bag. She looked around my sprawling penthouse, taking in the original artwork and the panoramic city views before locking eyes with me. There was no anger in her expression, just a cold, calculating clarity. She walked into my living room and took a seat on the white leather sofa, crossing her legs with precision. I remained standing, leaning against the kitchen island, pouring myself a fresh cup of coffee. I waited for her to start demanding explanations or hurling insults about the eviction. Instead, she smoothly reached into her coat pocket. "You do not need to explain anything to me," Jasmine said, her voice incredibly steady. "I already know." After the sheriffs locked us out of the office, Bradley threw a tantrum in the parking garage. He was screaming at his phone, threatening to sue the county. While he was distracted, I took his laptop out of his cardboard box. I sat in my car, cracked his password, and spent the last 3 hours reading through his emails and digital folders. I expected to find a banking error or a temporary freeze like he claimed. What I found was a vast, empty void. "He has absolutely nothing, Cassidy. Every single vendor invoice, every marketing expense for my brand, every dinner reservation and car lease was being paid by a shell company traced directly back to Apex Holdings. He has not possessed a single dollar of his own money in 3 years. He is flat broke." Jasmine leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. As a Black woman who built a lifestyle brand from an absolute zero starting balance, I know what actual hustle looks like. I spent 6 years grinding for every single follower and every sponsorship deal. I know what real money looks like, and I know how to spot a grifter. But Bradley played the ultimate illusion. When we met, he flashed his parents' Connecticut zip code like a black card. He brought me to their country club, charging $1,000 dinners to an account he claimed was his corporate expense tab. He paraded me through the legacy of the Wilson family, masking his profound incompetence behind the shiny veneer of generational wealth. I thought I was marrying a tech visionary who matched my ambition. I thought we were building an empire together. I did not realize I was hitching my brand to a parasite who was secretly draining his sister dry just to keep his golf club membership active. The anger in her voice was not directed at me. It was the white-hot fury of a self-made woman realizing her partner was a total fraud. "You built this entire operation while he was taking the credit," Jasmine continued, gesturing to my penthouse. "He sat in that massive corner office playing executive while you funded the very floor tiles under his feet. And the moment you cut the cord, he completely collapsed. He is a child playing dress-up." I walked over and sat in the armchair opposite her. "So why are you here, Jasmine?" I asked smoothly. "You know the truth. You know he has no money and no future. You could just walk away." Jasmine smiled, but it was a razor-sharp expression devoid of any warmth. "Because walking away is not enough," she replied. "When the eviction happened today, my brand took a massive hit. My followers watched me get thrown out by county sheriffs. Bradley embarrassed me on a global scale. Worse, he is legally my husband. If I file for divorce right now using a standard lawyer, he will try to claim half of my influencer income. He will argue that my brand grew during our marriage and demand spousal support because he is suddenly unemployed and penniless. I will not let a fake billionaire take half the money I worked for." She reached into her designer bag and pulled out a small silver flash drive. She placed it deliberately on the glass coffee table between us. I downloaded everything before I wiped his hard drive. Jasmine stated, her tone turning strictly transactional. "This drive contains every illegal financial maneuver Bradley attempted over the last 5 years. It has his emails discussing the forged contracts, his offshore gambling accounts, and his communications with your father about hiding debt from the bank. It is the exact ammunition your lawyer needs to bury him permanently." I stared at the silver drive glinting in the afternoon light. "And what exactly do you want in exchange for this?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "I want Cameron," she replied without missing a beat. "I saw him dismantle opposing counsel during a corporate lawsuit last year. He is a shark. I want your legal team to handle my divorce. I want Cameron to draft an ironclad separation agreement that leaves Bradley with absolutely nothing. He does not touch my brand. He does not touch my income. You get the evidence to destroy him, and I get protection to walk away clean. I looked up. It is a deal. I picked up the flash drive. Bradley sat in the driver's seat of his leased luxury SUV parked in the dimly lit subterranean garage of a cheap downtown strip mall. The engine idled, burning expensive imported fuel he could no longer afford to replace. The eviction from his glass and steel sanctuary was a catastrophic blow, but Jasmine vanishing with his primary laptop was the true death knell. He had frantically checked his personal banking applications on his smartphone, watching zeros populate across every single screen. The bank had ruthlessly locked his accounts. Apex Holdings had severed the corporate lifeline. He was suffocating in the dark. His hands trembled violently as he tore through the glove compartment, tossing vehicle registration papers and old toll receipts onto the passenger seat. He needed liquid cash immediately. He needed an escape hatch before the creditors realized he was a ghost. His frantic fingers brushed against a sleek, heavy piece of metal tucked inside a forgotten leather folio at the bottom of the center console. Bradley pulled the object into the dim interior light and stared at the matte black corporate credit card. It bore the original embossed logo of Cassidy's very first startup venture, predating the massive Apex Holdings corporate umbrella by several years. A sudden rush of adrenaline spiked his heart rate. 7 years ago, when Cassidy's technology company had just secured its first major round of venture funding, Richard had summoned her to the family dining room. Their father had slammed his heavy fist on the antique table, demanding that Bradley be added as an authorized user on the new corporate account. Richard had furiously argued that the eldest son needed elite credit lines to project authority in his own business dealings. Cassidy had firmly resisted warning them of the immense liability, but Richard had relentlessly bullied her into submission, accusing her of hoarding her newfound wealth to spite the family. She had issued the card, placed a quiet internal security freeze on its daily limit, and eventually migrated her primary operations to a totally new banking infrastructure. She had left this specific account open, but dormant purely to satisfy their father's fragile ego. Bradley flipped the heavy metal card over, reading the worn security code on the back. He had never used it. He had never needed to, not while Apex Holdings was silently paying all his lavish bills. But the account was still technically active. He could feel the potential salvation humming in his hands. He pulled a secondary burner laptop from his gym bag, powering it up and connecting to the coffee shop's unsecured wireless network transmitting from the floor above the garage. He typed furiously, his knuckles white with absolute tension. He accessed a dormant offshore payment portal he had covertly set up during one of his failed cryptocurrency ventures in the Cayman Islands. He inputted the black card's specific 16-digit sequence. The digital prompt requested an exact transfer amount. Bradley typed $150,000. He stared at the glowing screen, his breathing ragged and shallow in the confined space of the vehicle. He did not feel a single ounce of guilt or remorse for what he was about to do. He justified the massive theft, instantly muttering aloud to the empty car, "I deserve this. I am the eldest son. I am the rightful heir to the Wilson family legacy. She stole my birthright by hiding her wealth from us. This is my money. I am just taking back what absolutely belongs to me." He slammed his index finger onto the enter key, initiating the international wire transfer. The screen displayed a spinning green loading wheel. Bradley held his breath, praying the ancient corporate account still had the raw liquidity to clear the massive transaction. Miles away, high above the frantic desperation of the city streets, I sat at the polished marble espresso bar in my penthouse. The bright morning sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the sharp-focused features of my lead counsel. Cameron sat directly across from me, sipping a dark roast coffee, meticulously reviewing the contents of Jasmine's silver flash drive on his encrypted legal tablet. The drive was an absolute goldmine. Jasmine had delivered exactly what she promised. We had Bradley dead to rights on corporate espionage, forged vendor signatures, and blatant tax evasion. I was in the middle of authorizing Cameron to draft Jasmine's divorce settlement to protect her influencer income when my private secured mobile device chimed with a harsh, urgent tone. I glanced down at this glowing screen. A high-priority fraud alert from my legacy banking institution illuminated the display. The automated notification detailed an attempted international wire transfer of exactly $150,000 originating from a dormant authorized user card, Bradley's card. He was actually trying to drain funds from a 7-year-old account into a Cayman Islands shell company. The sheer stupidity of the act was staggering. He was cornered, panicking, and making the most reckless financial mistakes possible. I picked up the phone, my thumb hovering directly over the large red button labeled Decline and Report Fraud. It was my automatic business instinct to shut down his theft immediately, to freeze the metal card and send a final silent message that his access to my capital was permanently terminated. Cameron noticed the sudden shift in my posture. He lowered his encrypted tablet and leaned across the cool marble counter, his dark eyes locking onto the glowing screen of my mobile phone. He quickly read the detailed fraud alert, tracing the domestic origin point and the offshore destination. A slow, predatory smile spread across his face. He reached out and gently wrapped his hand around my wrist, physically stopping my thumb from pressing the red decline button. I looked up at him, silently questioning his sudden intervention. Cameron reached over and tapped the green button labeled Authorized Transaction instead. Let it process. Cameron stated, his voice a low, lethal murmur that echoed perfectly in the quiet kitchen. Blocking it just gets him a declined card. But letting him successfully steal corporate funds across international borders changes the entire game completely. He just moved stolen money offshore. Now it is a federal wire fraud felony. Cameron's predatory smile lingered in my mind long after the federal wire fraud alert vanished from my screen. We had Bradley neatly trapped in a perfectly constructed legal cage of his own making. The trap was set. The trap was sprung. The trap was inescapably secure. I slept that night with the profound tranquility of a woman who had finally excised a terminal rot from her life. But desperate people do not simply surrender when cornered. They lash out. They manipulate. They ignite catastrophic fires to obscure their own massive failures. The retaliation did not come from Bradley. He was too busy hiding from international banking authorities. The retaliation came from the architects of his delusion, my parents. At 6 the next morning, my private line began vibrating with a relentless, frantic rhythm. It was not Cameron. It was the director of public relations for Apex Holdings. She bypassed all standard protocols and ordered me to turn on the local news network immediately. I aimed the remote at the massive screen in my bedroom. The bright morning broadcast did not feature standard financial updates or market analyses. It featured my mother. Patricia was sitting in the center of her sprawling Connecticut living room. The camera angle was deliberately framed to capture the opulent marble fireplace and the antique chandeliers, contrasting sharply with her carefully orchestrated performance of absolute destitution. She wore a simple, unadorned gray sweater, completely devoid of her usual diamond tennis bracelets and heavy gold rings. She looked directly into the camera lens. Her eyes were wide, brimming with perfectly calibrated, glistening tears. "My own daughter threw us onto the street," Patricia sobbed, clutching a tissue with trembling hands. "My own flesh and blood. My own daughter. We gave her everything. We loved her unconditionally, and she repaid us by stealing her brother's brilliant corporate ideas to build her empire. She stole his vision. She stole his companies. She stole his future. Now she is evicting her aging parents from the only home we have ever known just to satisfy her ruthless sociopathic greed." Richard sat heavily beside her on the plush designer sofa. He wrapped a protective, comforting arm around her shaking shoulders, playing the role of the dignified patriarch, crushed by an unnatural betrayal. He stared solemnly at the reporter. "We raised a corporate predator," Richard stated, his voice thick with rehearsed sorrow. "She used our family connections to build Apex Holdings. She drained our resources. She exploited our good name. And the moment she secured her billions, she orchestrated a malicious financial coup to bankrupt her own brother and leave her elderly parents homeless. We are victims of elder abuse at the hands of a billionaire sociopath." The news anchor leaned forward, adopting an expression of profound journalistic sympathy. The anchor narrated the tragic downfall of the respectable Wilson family, completely omitting the reality of Bradley's crippling debts, Richard's catastrophic financial mismanagement, and the millions of dollars I had silently poured into their failing accounts. The broadcast displayed a split screen. On one side, Patricia weeping into her tissue. On the other side, a massive imposing photograph of my corporate headquarters. The narrative was simple, digestible, and utterly devastating. The ruthless billionaire daughter destroying the wholesome, loving family. The defamation campaign did not stop at the local morning broadcast. They had weaponized their country club connections and social media networks with terrifying efficiency. My tablet illuminated with hundreds of alerts as the news segment was clipped, shared, and rapidly monetized across every major digital platform. The internet erupted in a tidal wave of manufactured outrage. Influencers who had never met me suddenly published furious condemnations of my character. Financial bloggers speculated wildly about the ethical foundation of my entire corporation. Hashtags demanding investigations into Apex Holdings began trending nationally. My parents knew exactly what they were doing. They were not fighting a legal battle. They were fighting an asymmetric public relations war. They knew they could not defeat Cameron in a courtroom. They knew the paper trail proved my absolute innocence. So they dragged the conflict into the court of public opinion, where facts are entirely irrelevant and emotional performances dictate the verdict. They were holding my corporate reputation hostage, betting their fake tears against my real capital. They wanted me to bleed. They wanted me to bleed publicly. They wanted me to bleed until I surrendered. My secure phone rang again. This time, the caller identification displayed the name of the chairman of my board of directors. I answered the call, my posture rigid. Cassidy, the chairman, said, his voice completely stripped of its usual collegiate warmth. We have a severe crisis. The stock price of Apex Holdings has dropped 4% in the last 2 hours. Our institutional investors are panicking. Our major corporate partners are threatening to suspend our upcoming joint ventures. The optics of this situation are incredibly toxic. We cannot have the chief executive officer of this firm actively investigated for elder abuse and corporate theft, regardless of the actual truth. I need you in the primary boardroom in 30 minutes, he demanded. We are convening an emergency meeting. You must fix this nightmare today. I walked into the executive boardroom exactly 20 full minutes later. The expansive glass room was filled with the 12 most powerful stakeholders in my company. Their faces were uniformly grim. The massive digital monitors on the walls were broadcasting the viral clips of my mother crying. You must settle this immediately, the chairman commanded, pointing a heavy finger at the glowing screens. Your family has successfully weaponized the media against us. The damage to our brand is compounding every single minute. Pay them whatever they want. Restore their mortgage. Fund your brother. Buy their complete silence. Make these terrible headlines disappear permanently before the financial market closes today. We demand a quiet, lucrative settlement. We demand you pay them off with corporate funds. You must surrender to all of their outrageous demands right now. The 12 faces around the mahogany conference table expected submission. They expected the chief executive officer to crumble under the sheer weight of public scandal. The chairman leaned back in his chair, tapping his gold pen, waiting for me to authorize a multi-million-dollar hush fund for the people sharing my DNA. I looked at the glowing monitors displaying Patricia's weeping face on a continuous loop. I pressed the master power button on the console. The screens went black, plunging the boardroom into a heavy silence. I stood up slowly, smoothing my jacket, and locked eyes with the chairman. I will not authorize a single cent to pay them off, I stated. I do not negotiate with terrorists, even if we share a last name. The room erupted in chaotic protests. 2 board members slammed their hands down. The chairman's face flushed crimson. He accused me of letting familial squabbles jeopardize an international enterprise. He threatened a vote of no confidence to strip my title and forcefully remove me before the market closed. I let them shout. I let them exhaust their panicked corporate rhetoric. When the noise subsided, I walked slowly around the table, making deliberate eye contact with each of the 12 stakeholders. 3 years ago, I began keeping my volume dangerously low. The global supply chain completely collapsed. Our manufacturing partners went bankrupt overnight. Cargo ships were stranded. Our inventory dropped to zero. Do you remember the emergency meeting we held in this room? Do you remember the panic on your faces when our stock plummeted 15%? I paused behind the chairman. You all demanded bankruptcy protection. You demanded we liquidate our assets and surrender the company to our largest competitor. You begged me to wave the flag. I moved back toward the head of the table. Instead of surrendering, I flew to Vietnam, renegotiated 12 new logistics contracts, in 72 hours restructured our distribution network, and secured a massive government contract that quintupled our quarterly revenue. I saved this company. I built this empire while you sat in these expensive chairs and panicked. I did not flinch then, and I will absolutely not flinch now, just because my parents decided to throw a desperate, pathetic tantrum on local television. The chairman swallowed hard, his bluster slightly deflated, but his underlying anxiety remained. This is entirely different, Cassidy. This is public relations poison. They are painting you as a greedy elder abusing sociopath. The market hates instability. We cannot weather a protracted, ugly family feud in the media. If you do not settle this quietly today, we will have no choice but to vote you out to protect the shareholders. I placed my hands flat on the glass table, leaning in. Then vote me out. I challenged him. Fire me. Remove the only person who knows how to navigate the complex infrastructure of Apex Holdings. Watch what happens to your stock portfolios when the market realizes the architect of this enterprise has been forcibly removed by cowardly investors terrified of a fake news segment. But understand this completely. If you force me out, I will liquidate my majority shares, crash the company valuation, and start a rival firm tomorrow. The silence that followed was absolute. I had called their bluff, daring them to pull the trigger. They knew I was the engine driving their wealth. They knew they could not replace me. The chairman slowly lowered his pen, the threat of termination dissolving into reluctant submission. Excellent, I said, straightening my posture. Now that we have established who is actually running this company, let me explain how we are going to handle the Wilson family. I pressed a button on my smartwatch. The heavy boardroom doors swung open and Cameron walked in. He wore a sharp charcoal suit carrying a thick stack of legal briefs. He moved with the predatory grace of a man who lived for corporate warfare. He handed a bound document to the chairman, then distributed identical copies to every board member around the table. My parents and my brother initiated a public relations war because they believed I would behave like a terrified victim, I explained. They assumed I would desperately protect my corporate image by throwing money at them. They relied on the archaic notion that family loyalty supersedes survival. They were fundamentally wrong. I pointed to the documents in their hands. As of 10 minutes ago, my legal team officially filed a massive countersuit in federal court against Richard Patricia and Bradley Wilson. We are suing them for aggravated defamation, extreme public libel, and systemic financial fraud. We are not hiding behind closed doors or issuing weak public relations statements. We are going on the offensive. The chairman flipped through the legal brief, scanning the dense language Cameron had drafted. This is a declaration of total war, the chairman whispered, looking up at me. It is an extermination, I corrected him coldly. I have Jasmine's flash drive detailing Bradley's massive wire fraud, offshore gambling accounts, and forged vendor contracts. I have banking ledgers proving I personally funded every single luxury item my parents own. I have the receipts, the emails, and the digital footprints proving their entire media campaign is a malicious extortion attempt. They wanted to drag my name through the mud to see if I would break. Instead, I am going to drag them into a federal courtroom and dismantle their entire existence piece by piece in front of a judge. I looked around the room, ensuring there was no ambiguity left in the air. The battle lines have been drawn at the courthouse steps. There will be no settlements. There will be no hush money. There will be no quiet resolutions. By the time my legal team is finished, they will not just be utterly broke. They will be facing significant federal prison sentences for wire fraud and extortion. Now, if there are no further questions regarding my leadership, this meeting is officially adjourned. The federal courthouse in downtown Manhattan felt less like a sanctuary of justice and more like a gladiatorial arena. News vans idled along the sidewalks, their satellite dishes extended toward the overcast sky. Paparazzi and financial journalists swarmed the marble steps, hungry for the spectacle of the Wilson family destroying itself. I walked through the heavy double doors flanked by my private security detail, and Cameron ignoring the barrage of shouted questions from the desperate reporters blocking the entry. Inside courtroom 4, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. The wooden gallery benches were packed shoulder to shoulder with reporters, local bloggers, and curious onlookers waiting for blood. Across the center aisle, my parents sat behind the plaintiff's table. They had perfectly orchestrated their appearance. Patricia wore a faded beige cardigan, her shoulders hunched forward to project absolute frailty. Richard sat with a slight tremble in his hands, staring blankly at the polished mahogany table. They looked like terrified, destitute victims of corporate cruelty. Bradley sat beside them, wearing a custom navy suit that projected the exact image of a wronged tech visionary. Bradley's lead attorney, a slick corporate litigator named Vance, paced in front of the jury box with practiced theatricality. He painted a masterful, entirely fabricated picture of the Wilson family dynamic. He described Bradley not as a parasitic grifter, but as a devoted, brilliant older brother who had sacrificed his own entrepreneurial ambitions to nurture his sister's fledgling startup. Vance spun a narrative of a cohesive, loving family that pooled their limited resources to support my dreams, only to be brutally discarded the moment the company achieved billion-dollar valuations. According to Vance, I was a ruthless opportunist who had stolen Bradley's proprietary intellectual property, locked him out of the corporate infrastructure he helped build, and tossed my aging parents onto the street to maximize my quarterly profit margins. The aggressive reporters in the crowded gallery scribbled furiously on their digital notepads, completely captivated by the tragic tale of the betrayed older brother taking on the ruthless billionaire sister. When Bradley took the witness stand, his performance was sickeningly flawless. He adjusted the microphone, looking directly at the jury panel with an expression of profound, lingering sorrow. Under Vance's gentle questioning, Bradley began weaving an elaborate web of absolute lies regarding the foundational days of Apex Holdings. He spoke nostalgically about working out of our parents' cold garage, claiming he spent thousands of hours awake until dawn, fueled by cheap coffee and sheer determination to see me succeed. He testified that he single-handedly authored the primary source code for the proprietary logistics algorithm that launched my first company. I sat in the dim garage writing line after line of complex code while Cassidy slept. Bradley told the hushed courtroom, his voice cracking with manufactured emotion. I taught her everything she knows about system architecture. I mentored her. I guided her. I gave her the keys to the kingdom because I loved my sister. I trusted her implicitly, and I never demanded a formal equity contract because I believed family loyalty was always stronger than corporate greed. She took my software, rebranded it under her own name, and erased my entire contribution from the company history. Patricia dabbed her eyes with a tissue from the plaintiff's table. Richard patted her hand. The jury looked visibly moved by the display. It was a spectacular exhibition of weaponized empathy. I sat perfectly still beside Cameron, my face an unreadable mask of cold stone. I did not glare. I did not shake my head in protest. I simply watched my brother commit blatant, easily verifiable perjury under oath. He was so incredibly arrogant, so accustomed to our parents shielding him from the consequences of his actions, that he actually believed he could lie his way through a federal fraud trial. He thought the courtroom was just another country club dinner, where he could charm the audience with stolen valor. He fundamentally misunderstood the environment he had stepped into. The legal battlefield was not governed by maternal favoritism or empty bravado. It was governed by brutal, unforgiving facts. And I had brought all the receipts to bury him permanently. The sheer audacity of his fabricated narrative was almost impressive. He had rehearsed every single inflection, every calculated pause, for dramatic effect. My parents watched him with unmasked pride, completely convinced that their golden son had finally outsmarted the system. They believed that this theatrical performance would inevitably force me into a quiet, extremely lucrative, permanent financial settlement. Vance concluded his long, direct examination and confidently returned to his seat, looking immensely satisfied with the emotional damage he had inflicted on my character. The judge nodded toward our table. Cameron stood up slowly. He did not rush. He did not look angry. He simply picked up a massive, thick stack of bound watermarked documents and walked deliberately toward the center of the room. He bypassed the wooden podium, completely standing just a few feet away from the witness box. Bradley shifted uncomfortably, his confident facade slipping for a fraction of a second as he eyed the heavy stack of papers in Cameron's hands. You testified that you authored the core logistical algorithms for Apex Holdings. Cameron stated, his voice ringing with absolute chilling clarity. You testified that you spent thousands of hours engaging in complex system architecture. These documents are the original unedited server logs, keystroke trackers, and IP access records from the exact time frame you just described. Cameron deliberately dropped the massive stack onto the wooden railing of the witness box with a deafening thud that loudly echoed across the entire silent room. Before we review these access logs, Cameron continued his predatory smile, returning, I would like you to explain to the jury the fundamental difference between a local variable and a global variable in Python, since you are supposedly a master software architect. Bradley stared down at the documents, his jaw dropping open and closing repeatedly without producing a single coherent sound. The silence in the federal courtroom was absolute. The jury stared at him, their expressions shifting from manufactured sympathy to glaring suspicion. Cameron stood there, letting the silence amplify Bradley's complete technological illiteracy. When Bradley finally stuttered out a nonsensical string of technical jargon, Cameron simply smiled, thanked him, and returned to our table. Vance leaped out of his chair, his face flushed with panic. Desperate for a massive distraction to salvage his crumbling narrative and redirect the jury's attention away from his client's perjury, he loudly called his next witness, Jasmine Wilson. Jasmine walked down the aisle with impeccable posture, wearing a crimson suit that projected absolute authority. My mother leaned forward at the plaintiff's table, a hopeful smile breaking through her powdered face. Patricia firmly believed Jasmine was a loyal daughter-in-law, ready to testify about my supposed cruelty and sociopathic greed. Bradley slumped in his chair, wiping nervous sweat from his forehead, clearly expecting his wife to throw him a desperately needed lifeline. Jasmine placed her steady hand on the Bible, swore the binding oath, and took her seat directly in the witness box. Vance approached her with a patronizing smile. He began his direct examination with leading questions designed to completely assassinate my character. He asked her to describe my lifestyle. He prompted her to detail the extravagant corporate dinners, the luxury penthouse, and the designer wardrobe I supposedly hoarded, while my family suffered in the trenches. Jasmine looked directly at Vance, her elegant expression completely devoid of human warmth. She did not look at Bradley. She did not look at my stunned parents. She looked exclusively at the jury. Cassidy lives an extravagant lifestyle because she actually earned it. Jasmine stated, her voice slicing through the heavy courtroom air like a sharpened blade. Vance blinked rapidly, his patronizing smile instantly freezing on his face. He quickly tried to interrupt her, but Jasmine leaned much closer to the microphone. She earned every single dollar. Jasmine continued, her voice commanding the room, while my husband spent the last 5 years functioning as a corporate parasite. Vance frantically objected, aggressively waving his hands, but the judge firmly overruled him, entirely captivated by the sudden shift in the narrative. Bradley told me he was a technology pioneer. Jasmine testified, her tone sharp. He drove a $200,000 imported luxury sports car. He wore bespoke Italian suits. He ordered $1,000 bottles of imported wine at exclusive country club dinners. I assumed he was appropriately funding our lavish life through his brilliant innovations. The reality was much darker and far more embarrassing. He was actively using a corporate credit card tied directly to a massive shell company, funded entirely by his younger sister. While he was out leasing luxury vehicles to impress his wealthy golf buddies, the entry-level employees at his startup company were having their paychecks consistently bounce. He was illegally redirecting their payroll funds to cover his elite country club membership dues. The crowded gallery erupted into a loud chorus of shocked murmurs. My mother pressed her trembling hands against her mouth, her face draining of all remaining color. Richard stared blankly at Jasmine, as if she had sprouted a second head. Vance was furiously shouting rapid-fire legal objections, desperate to formally strike the devastating testimony from the official court record. The judge loudly slammed her heavy wooden gavel, demanding order and instructing Jasmine to continue speaking. Bradley gripped the solid edge of his table, his knuckles turning pure white. "You are lying," he hissed, his panicked voice barely carrying over the ambient noise. Jasmine turned her dark gaze directly toward him, her eyes locking onto his terrified face. "I am not lying, Bradley," she replied smoothly, radiating sheer confidence. "And I brought the exact irrefutable receipts to permanently prove it." Jasmine reached slowly into the inner breast pocket of her tailored crimson blazer. She deliberately pulled out the small, highly polished silver flash drive. It glinted brightly under the harsh, unyielding fluorescent lights of the silent courtroom. She proudly held it up for the federal judge and the captivated jury to see clearly. "Before I packed my bags and left him forever, I covertly accessed his unsecured personal laptop." Jasmine declared, her powerful voice echoing perfectly across the room. "I downloaded his entire digital footprint. This tiny drive contains every single bounced payroll ledger, every intentionally forged vendor invoice, and every single illegal offshore transaction he attempted over the past 5 agonizing years. But the absolute most important digital file on this drive happened just last week." Cameron stood up, fully ready to formally accept the physical evidence. Jasmine turned purposefully toward the judge. "Last week, after his primary accounts were rightfully and permanently frozen, Bradley deliberately attempted to initiate a completely unauthorized, highly illegal international wire transfer. He intentionally used a dormant corporate credit card belonging exclusively to Cassidy's original startup venture. He successfully tried to move exactly $150,000 into a covert, totally unregulated offshore cryptocurrency account located in the Cayman Islands. He willfully committed federal wire fraud from the front seat of his leased vehicle. The tense air in the massive courtroom instantly ignited. The reporters scrambled out of their wooden benches, rushing the heavy doors to transmit the explosive breaking news. Patricia let out a loud, piercing wail, burying her tear-stained face in Richard's shaking shoulder. Bradley completely shattered. The thin facade of the brilliant, victimized tech visionary dissolved instantly into pure, violently explosive animal rage. "You treacherous, ungrateful witch," Bradley screamed at the top of his lungs. He kicked his wooden chair backward. He lunged over the plaintiff's table, his face contorted in absolute fury, sprinting directly toward the witness stand. Jasmine did not flinch. 2 armed federal bailiffs immediately intercepted him mid-stride. The heavy thud of Bradley being tackled to the hardwood floor echoed like a gunshot. As he thrashed violently, his expensive suit tearing at the seam, they aggressively pinned his arms behind his back. The judge hammered her gavel with rapid strikes, demanding immediate order. She directed the bailiffs to remove Bradley and hold him in a cell for direct contempt. As they dragged my brother through the heavy doors, his desperate screams faded into a pathetic whimper. The gallery remained perfectly silent, paralyzed by his public implosion. Jasmine remained seated in the witness box, completely unfazed, smoothing a wrinkle on her skirt. She executed her absolute destruction of Bradley with chilling precision. Vance, his attorney, stood frozen behind the plaintiff table, watching his entire fabricated defense crumble into dust. He had no redirect. He had no further questions. He simply waved a trembling hand, dismissing Jasmine from the stand. My mother buried her face in her hands, her performative weeping replaced by genuine suffocating panic. But Richard Wilson was not a man who surrendered to reality. His golden son had just been dragged away in handcuffs, and his son's wife had successfully handed the federal government the exact blueprints to prosecute him. Instead of cutting his losses, Richard's immense, blinding ego took absolute control. He angrily shoved his chair back and marched directly toward the witness stand before Vance could even officially call him. He swore the oath with a harsh, aggressive tone, glaring down at me, as if his sheer willpower could rewrite the facts of the universe. Vance approached the podium, sweating profusely, clearly terrified of what his own client might say next. He asked a simple, broad question about the financial dynamics of our family. That was all the prompting Richard needed. He gripped the edges of the witness box, leaning aggressively toward the jury. "Cassidy is an ungrateful, malicious parasite," Richard bellowed, his face flushing a deep, dangerous crimson. "I built the Wilson legacy with my bare hands. I possess excellent, impeccable credit. I single-handedly kept our family estate afloat during multiple economic downturns. I provided the very roof over her head, the food on her plate, and the elite education that allowed her to even comprehend basic business principles. She owes us everything. She took our resources, stole her brother's brilliant concepts, and hoarded her billions while actively attempting to bankrupt the very people who created her. I am the sole financial provider for this family. I always have been. She is nothing but a ruthless thief attempting to destroy her betters." Richard panted heavily, his chest heaving as he stared down the jury panel, fully expecting them to validate his patriarchal outrage. He firmly believed his own delusions. He actually thought his historical wealth still existed, completely ignoring the decades of reckless spending and catastrophic investments that had hollowed out his accounts. Vance nervously thanked him and sat down, refusing to make eye contact with anyone in the room. The judge turned her attention to our table. Cameron stood up. He did not bring a heavy stack of server logs this time. He did not bring a digital tablet or a silver flash drive. He held a single crisp manila folder containing one certified legal document. He walked with a terrifying predatory slowness, his highly polished shoes clicking methodically against the hardwood floor. He stopped a few feet from the witness box, allowing the silence to stretch until Richard shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Mr. Wilson." Cameron began, his voice dangerously soft and conversational. "You just testified under penalty of perjury that you possess excellent credit and that you single-handedly kept your family estate afloat. You stated unequivocally that you are the sole financial provider for your family. Is that an accurate summary of your sworn statement?" "Absolutely," Richard spat back, lifting his chin defiantly. "My financial record is completely impeccable. I pay my own way. I always have." Cameron opened the manila folder. He pulled out a thick packet of papers secured with a heavy blue legal seal. He handed it directly to the court clerk to log into evidence, then handed a duplicate copy to the trembling hands of Mr. Vance. Cameron turned back to face my father. "This document is a certified, unredacted financial disclosure and deed registry for a private wealth management firm known as Apex Holdings," Cameron stated, his voice ringing clearly across the gallery. "I want to draw your attention to page 4, detailing the corporate ownership structure, and page 7, detailing the outbound operational expenditures over the last 36 months. Richard scowled, refusing to look at the paper. "I do not care about her shell companies. She stole that money." Cameron ignored the outburst, stepping closer to the microphone. The gallery leaned forward collectively, sensing the final fatal blow. "Apex Holdings is a private entity wholly owned by Cassidy Cameron," announced to the silent courtroom. "She is the sole proprietor. She is the sole source of capital. And according to these certified banking ledgers, Apex Holdings has been the exclusive entity paying the primary mortgage on your Connecticut estate for the past 3 consecutive years. Furthermore, this exact same holding company has been paying the monthly lease on your son Bradley's luxury vehicles, covering his exorbitant country club dues and funding the direct operating costs of his completely insolvent technology firm." The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent gray. Then he seemed to shrink into himself, his patriarchal illusion entirely shattered. Bradley thrashed violently against the 2 armed bailiffs who had just pinned him to the floor moments earlier, twisting his neck to scream across the courtroom. "It is a lie!" Bradley shrieked, his voice cracking with panicked desperation. She forged those documents. She hacked the banking grid. She is a thief. Look at the signatures. Cameron did not even dignify the outburst with a glance in Bradley's direction. He simply tapped the open folder in front of Richard. Read the routing numbers, Mr. Wilson Cameron instructed, his voice cutting clearly through the rising din of the room. Read the name of the anonymous angel investment firm that miraculously stepped in to save your primary estate from foreclosure 36 months ago. Read the name of the holding company that quietly absorbed your massive defaulting lines of credit when every single major bank in New England rejected your loan applications. Richard looked down at the highlighted text. His lips moved soundlessly. The psychological devastation hit him with the force of a freight train. For 3 years, he had proudly boasted at his exclusive country club about his elite financial acumen, claiming he had brilliantly navigated a complex corporate restructuring to save the family fortune. He had actively mocked me during holiday dinners, using his miraculous financial recovery as proof of his superior intellect, telling everyone that my little tech venture would inevitably collapse, while his legacy remained bulletproof. The reality was staring him in the face. His legacy was entirely bankrupt. His pride, his upper-class facade, his expensive tailored suits, and the very roof over his head had been fully subsidized by the daughter he relentlessly called a disappointment. I was the anonymous angel investor. I was the silent benefactor keeping the Wilson family from absolute destitution. Patricia, still seated at the plaintiff's table, suddenly stood up. She swayed heavily on her feet, her hands clutching her throat. Her meticulously maintained image of the suffering, victimized matriarch shattered completely. She looked directly at me, her eyes wide with a horrific realization. The money, she gasped, her voice barely audible over the courtroom noise. The country club dues, the renovations, you paid for it. You paid for all of it. I met her gaze without a single trace of emotion. I paid for it. I confirmed, my voice cold and steady. I bought your reality. And then I stopped. Patricia let out a sharp, breathless choke. Her eyes rolled back into her head and her knees buckled. She collapsed entirely, her body hitting the polished hardwood floor in a dead faint. Vance, her attorney, jumped backward in shock, knocking his heavy leather chair over while the court clerk rushed forward. Richard scrambled out of the witness box, practically tripping over the wooden steps as he rushed to his unconscious wife, kneeling beside her and desperately patting her pale cheeks. The judge slammed her gavel repeatedly, the sharp cracks echoing like gunfire over the sheer pandemonium. Order! She bellowed, her voice commanding absolute authority. I will clear this entire gallery if you do not immediately come to order. The reporters and onlookers slowly quieted down, though the electric tension in the room remained suffocating. The bailiffs managed to haul Bradley up from the floor, though they kept his arms firmly restrained behind his back. He was hyperventilating, his expensive navy suit wrinkled and covered in dust from the floor. He glared at Cameron, sweat dripping down his forehead. You cannot do this, Bradley spat, his voice trembling with sheer terror. You cannot just cut us off. We have equity. We have familial rights. Vance, do your job. Object to this. Tell them it is a trick. Vance did not move. He stood awkwardly near the fallen chair, staring at the certified financial disclosures in his hands. He was a seasoned corporate litigator, and he knew exactly what a bulletproof paper trail looked like. He slowly looked up at Bradley, then turned to the judge. Your Honor? Vance stammered, his voice devoid of all its previous theatrical bluster. The plaintiff requests a brief recess to confer with counsel. The judge glared down at Vance from the bench, her expression an impenetrable mask of judicial fury. She looked at the comprehensive stack of banking records, then shifted her gaze to the silver flash drive sitting securely in the evidence tray, the drive Jasmine had provided just minutes earlier, detailing Bradley's massive, undeniable wire fraud. There will be no recess, Mr. Vance, the judge, stated, her tone dripping with absolute finality. This court has reviewed the certified financial disclosures submitted by the defense. It is abundantly clear that the plaintiff's claims of intellectual property theft and financial damages are not only entirely baseless, but represent a malicious, fabricated attempt to extort the defendant. Richard looked up from where he knelt beside the stirring Patricia. But she owes us, he protested weakly. his voice stripped of all its former patriarchal authority. "She is our daughter. This court is not concerned with your twisted family dynamics, Mr. Wilson," the judge snapped sharply. "This court is concerned with perjury, extortion, and systemic financial fraud. Based on the irrefutable documentary evidence presented today, I am dismissing the plaintiff's civil suit in its entirety with prejudice. You will not be permitted to refile these fabricated claims in this or any other jurisdiction." Furthermore, the judge continued, locking onto Bradley. "I am ordering you to be taken into custody for the wire fraud evidence Jasmine provided. This court is now permanently adjourned." The heavy oak doors of courtroom 4 swung outward, releasing us into the chaotic, blinding glare of the hallway. The ambient murmur of the corridor instantly transformed into an aggressive, deafening roar. Dozens of camera flashes strobed in rapid succession, illuminating the polished marble walls like lightning strikes. A wall of reporters and aggressive paparazzi surged forward, their microphones thrust over the velvet rope barriers. They were no longer shouting questions about a betrayed tech visionary. They were screaming for details about offshore accounts, felony wire fraud, and the spectacular public implosion of the Wilson family. A wedge of federal bailiffs forced a path through the media gauntlet, roughly escorting my brother toward the holding cells. Bradley's custom Navy suit, so meticulously tailored to project authority just an hour ago, was now violently rumpled. The cuffs binding his wrists behind his back forced his shoulders forward, entirely stripping him of his arrogant posture. His face was a mask of sheer, unadulterated terror. He ducked his head, desperately trying to hide from the relentless barrage of camera lenses, capturing his absolute ruin. A reporter shouted a question about his Cayman Islands accounts, and Bradley physically flinched as if he had been struck. There was no charm left. There were no fabricated stories about late-night coding sessions. There was only a humiliated criminal walking toward a federal prison sentence. Cameron and I walked deliberately behind the protective wedge of our private security team. The air in the hallway tasted metallic, charged with the manic energy of a high-profile scandal breaking in real time. We moved toward the bank of brass elevators at the end of the corridor. We were 3 paces away when a sudden, desperate movement broke through the perimeter of my security detail. Richard and Patricia Wilson threw themselves into our path. They had sprinted out of the courtroom, completely abandoning the dignified upper-class facade they had spent decades cultivating. Richard's face was slick with a cold sweat, his breathing ragged and shallow. He looked utterly terrified, his eyes darting frantically between me and the flashing cameras documenting his every move. Patricia looked even worse. Her perfectly styled hair was disheveled, and the manufactured frailty she had weaponized in the courtroom had been entirely replaced by genuine suffocating panic. "Cassidy." Richard gasped, holding his hands up in a placating gesture. "Cassidy. Wait. You have to wait. We need to talk about this. We need to go back inside and explain to the judge that this is a massive misunderstanding. You cannot just leave us like this." I did not break my stride. I maintained my cold, steady gaze, forcing Richard to physically backpedal to avoid being trampled by my security team. "There are no misunderstandings, Richard." I stated, my voice cutting through the noise of the flashing cameras. "There are only consequences. You sat in a federal courtroom and willingly participated in an extortion attempt. You swore under oath that I stole from you. You demanded my company. Now you get to live with the exact reality you created." As I moved to step around him, Patricia let out a guttural, desperate wail. She lunged forward, entirely disregarding the cameras, the reporters, and the dozens of onlookers. She dropped heavily to her knees on the cold, dirty marble floor of the courthouse. She reached out with trembling hands and tightly grabbed the hem of my tailored skirt. "Please, Cassidy." Patricia sobbed, her voice echoing shrilly down the corridor. Her tears were no longer calculated or performative. They were fueled by the absolute terror of impending poverty. "Please reopen the Apex accounts. You have to turn the funding back on. The bank called yesterday. They are going to foreclose on the Connecticut estate. The country club suspended our membership. We have absolutely nothing left. We will lose the house. We will lose everything." We are your parents." The entire hallway fell into a stunned, breathless silence. The reporters stopped shouting, completely captivated by the sight of the wealthy, supposedly victimized matriarch groveling at the feet of the daughter she had just tried to destroy. The cameras continued to flash, immortalizing Patricia's humiliation from every conceivable angle. I stopped walking. I looked down at the woman gripping my clothing. I felt a strange, profound sense of clinical detachment. For 30 years, this exact display of weaponized emotion had controlled my entire existence. Whenever Bradley failed, whenever he stole, whenever he needed to be bailed out of his latest catastrophic mistake, Patricia would deploy these exact tears. She would sob, she would invoke family loyalty, and she would guilt me into emptying my savings to fix his problems. She had trained me to believe that my sole purpose on this earth was to act as a financial shield for her golden child. I looked at her tear-stained face, searching for even a single ounce of the crushing guilt that used to paralyze me. I found absolutely nothing. "You are not my parents," I said, my voice completely devoid of anger or sorrow. "You are my former dependents. You spent my entire life telling me I was a disappointment, telling me my ambitions were a waste of time, and telling me I needed to sacrifice my future to support Bradley. You gladly took my money to fund your elite social status, and you never once asked where it came from. You just spent it. You lived in a mansion I paid for. You drank wine I bought. You wore clothes I funded. And the very second you thought you could extract more wealth by destroying my reputation in a federal court, you conspired to lock me in a cage." Richard stepped forward, his hands shaking violently as he looked at the cameras surrounding us. "Cassidy, please lower your voice. People are watching. The media is right here. We can handle this privately. We can draft a settlement. I will apologize. I will do whatever you want. Just reinstate the credit lines. I cannot file for bankruptcy. It will ruin my legacy." "Your legacy is a mathematically proven lie," I replied, staring directly into my father's terrified eyes. "You have no credit. You have no assets. You have a mountain of debt that I am no longer subsidizing. Your son is going to federal prison for wire fraud, and you are going to go back to Connecticut and pack your bags before the bank seizes the property." Patricia clutched my skirt tighter, burying her face against the fabric. "You cannot do this to us. You are our daughter. You owe us respect." I calmly reached down and grasped her wrists. I pried her fingers off my clothing with deliberate, unyielding force. She gasped, looking up at me as if she had never actually seen me before. "I owe you exactly what you earned," I stated firmly, dropping her hands back onto the marble floor. "Which is nothing." I stepped back, physically detaching myself from the wreckage of the Wilson family. I stood tall, smoothing my jacket, completely untouched by the desperate, pleading tears that had once governed my every decision. I turned my back on them and walked directly into the waiting elevator, leaving my parents kneeling in the hallway flashes as the doors slid silently shut. The heavy brass doors of the elevator began to slide shut. The gap narrowed to mere inches, promising to finally sever me from the toxic wreckage of my family. Suddenly, a bruised, frantic hand shot through the opening. The safety sensors blared a sharp, piercing warning beep, and the doors violently bounced back open. Richard stood there, panting heavily, his expensive silk tie askew, and his face flushed with a terrifying mixture of rage and sheer panic. He physically blocked the exit, his chest heaving as he stared at me. Patricia crawled forward on her hands and knees across the polished marble, her tear-streaked face reflecting in the polished brass of the elevator frame. The press surged closer against the heavy velvet ropes. Every camera lens in the federal courthouse was trained directly on this final, humiliating spectacle. The reporters held their microphones high above their heads, capturing every ragged breath my parents took. "You cannot just walk away from us," Richard wheezed, his voice cracking under the immense pressure of his collapsing reality. "You are a Wilson. We are your flesh and blood. I am sorry. I am so incredibly sorry for everything I said in that courtroom just now. We were completely misled by Bradley. We did not know the extent of his lies or his wire fraud. You have to believe us, Cassidy. We love you. We have always loved you." Patricia grabbed the edge of the elevator track, pulling her upper body up slightly. We were just trying to protect the family legacy. She sobbed, her expensive mascara running in dark, jagged streams down her pale cheeks. We made terrible mistakes. We admit that right now. Please just come back to the house with us. We can sit down at the formal dining table and fix this together. You are our daughter. We will make it right. Just make the phone call to the bank and stop the foreclosure. I looked at the two people who had brought me into this world. I did not feel a single shred of the crippling guilt they were so desperately trying to weaponize. I felt only a cold, clinical disgust. I stepped out of the elevator cabin, forcing Richard to stumble backward into the blinding glare of the camera flashes. I was not going to hide behind closing doors. I was going to finish this in the exact public forum they had so eagerly invited to watch my downfall. Do not dare use the word love with me, I stated, my voice echoing sharply off the high vaulted ceilings of the corridor. You do not love me. You love the balance in the Apex Holdings accounts. Your affection is entirely transactional, and your apologies are nothing but pure financial desperation. You did not come to this tearful realization because you suddenly recognized my worth as a human being. You came to it because your platinum credit cards declined at the country club this morning, and your golden son was just escorted to a federal holding cell. Richard flinched as if I had struck him across the face with a heavy stone. Cassidy, that is not fair at all. We raised you in a good home. We provided for your education. You provided a glittering stage for Bradley to perform on, I countered sharply, taking a deliberate, aggressive step toward him. You spent 30 years cultivating a patriarchal delusion. Let us talk about your version of providing. When I won the National Coding Championship in high school, you skipped the ceremony to watch Bradley play a meaningless practice round of golf. When I needed seed money for my first startup, you laughed in my face and told me to find a wealthy husband. But when Bradley crashed his third luxury SUV, you bought him a fourth. Every single time he failed, you gladly wrote a check. Every time he stole a brilliant idea, you bought him an aggressive lawyer to silence the victims. Every time he ruined a business venture, you blamed the economy and bought him a new sports car to soothe his fragile ego. Patricia let out a ragged, echoing wail, burying her face in her trembling hands. We did not know the truth about the money, she cried out, her voice shrill. We thought the funding was from the Historical Family Trust. We genuinely thought Bradley was managing it properly. You knew the family trust was completely bankrupt 5 years ago? I fired back mercilessly, stripping away her final pathetic excuse. You knew Richard lost the primary investments in a series of catastrophic commercial real estate deals. You actively chose to look the other way because acknowledging the financial truth meant admitting your entire social existence was a massive fraud. You let Bradley funnel my capital into his failing tech company, and you smiled proudly for the society papers while he took the absolute credit for my hard work. You starved my ambitions to feed his endless entitlement. You sat at holiday dinners and relentlessly mocked my career while secretly living off the very money I was generating. I stepped closer, forcing them to look me directly in the eyes. I leaned in, ensuring the cluster of eager reporters caught every single syllable of my declaration. You didn't love Bradley, I said coldly. You loved the idea of a son, and you let that idea bankrupt you. I'm not your safety net anymore. Welcome to the real world. Richard's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, resembling a suffocating fish. The patriarchal authority he had wielded like a heavy, blunt weapon his entire life was completely gone, leaving behind nothing but a terrified, broke old man facing total ruin. Patricia slumped entirely to the floor, her body shaking with violent, uncontrollable sobs. She reached out one last time, her manicured fingers weakly brushing the polished leather toe of my designer shoe. What are we supposed to do now? Patricia wailed, her voice breaking into a pathetic shriek that echoed down the long corridor. Where are we supposed to go when they take the house? You are going to do exactly what you casually told me to do when I was 18 years old and begging for college tuition. I replied, my tone devoid of all mercy or hesitation. You are going to figure it out yourself. You are going to watch the bank foreclose on the Connecticut estate. You are going to sell your remaining luxury cars to pay your mounting legal fees. You are going to learn exactly how to survive without someone else subsidizing your miserable existence. I turned my back on them forever. I did not look at the flashing cameras. I did not acknowledge the reporters aggressively shouting my name. I simply adjusted my leather briefcase on my shoulder and began to walk. My polished heels clicked rhythmically against the floor, creating a steady, powerful beat that signaled my absolute liberation from their toxic grip. I walked away down the marble corridor, leaving my parents sobbing on the floor, surrounded by the press they invited. The heavy oak doors of the courthouse closed firmly behind me, instantly silencing the pathetic, desperate echoes of my parents' sobbing. That single, explosive afternoon triggered a brutal, unstoppable domino effect that leveled the Wilson family legacy with breathtaking speed. The financial news networks immediately seized the story, broadcasting the scandal across every major platform. The meticulously crafted narrative of the brilliant self-made tech prodigy Bradley Wilson was publicly slaughtered. In its place, the world was introduced to the reality of a desperate, incompetent fraudster who embezzled from his own sister to maintain a hollow, glittering facade. The federal government did not waste a single second. Armed with the pristine, heavily categorized digital evidence Jasmine had handed over, the prosecution built an airtight, lethal case for wire fraud, corporate espionage, and systemic financial extortion. Bradley never even made it to trial. Faced with decades of potential prison time and completely abandoned by the high-priced defense attorneys, he could no longer afford to retain his exhausted public defender, forced him to accept a brutal plea deal. 2 months after his dramatic courtroom arrest, my brother stood before a federal judge. He was no longer wearing his custom Italian Navy suits or flashing his arrogant, entitled smile. He wore a standard-issue orange jumpsuit, his hands heavily shackled to his waist. The golden boy who had spent his entire life being told he was destined to rule the corporate world without ever having to work for it was sentenced to 84 months in a federal penitentiary. His insolvent technology firm was violently liquidated to pay partial restitution to the investors he had defrauded. His luxury cars were instantly repossessed. His expensive watches were seized by federal agents. He was left with absolutely nothing but a concrete cell and the terrifying realization that his mother could no longer write a check to save him from his own incompetence. While Bradley was being aggressively processed into the federal prison system, Jasmine executed the final phase of her immaculate exit strategy. She filed for divorce the very next morning. Cameron represented her, moving with the exact same predatory legal precision he had used to dismantle Richard on the witness stand. Bradley had zero leverage, zero hidden assets, and zero credibility left to fight back. The divorce proceedings were an absolute massacre. Jasmine retained full, uncontested physical and legal custody of their children. She completely insulated her massive influencer empire from the Wilson family's toxic fallout, utilizing a series of ironclad asset protection trusts Cameron explicitly established for her. She walked away from the marriage completely clean, her wealth secured and her public image actually elevated. She brilliantly pivoted her online platform, launching a new, highly lucrative campaign focused on female empowerment, financial independence, and identifying toxic relationships. She monetized her escape from the Wilson family with unapologetic ruthlessness, turning her ex-husband's federal indictment into a multi-million-dollar rebranding opportunity. But the most spectacular, agonizing collapse belonged entirely to Richard and Patricia. The moment the Apex Holdings capital officially stopped flowing, their fabricated universe instantly disintegrated. The bank moved aggressively to foreclose on the sprawling Connecticut estate. For decades, that massive house had served as the ultimate monument to Richard's fragile ego, the physical proof of his supposed superiority. Watching the bank rip it away from him broke his spirit entirely. They were given exactly 30 days to vacate the premises, and the transition was an absolute nightmare. I did not attend the eviction, but the private security team overseeing the property transfer provided a comprehensive, highly detailed report. There were no professional moving companies with white glove service. There were no assistants wrapping their expensive crystal in bubble wrap or carefully transporting their imported rugs. Richard and Patricia, completely stripped of their wealth, their pristine credit, and their pride, were forced to rent a battered, rust-stained moving truck with the absolute last of their remaining cash. My mother, who had spent her entire life harshly judging the domestic staff and viciously criticizing the wardrobes of her peers, was reduced to hauling heavy taping cardboard boxes across the manicured lawn she no longer owned. Her designer heels sank deep into the mud. Her expensive silk blouses were stained with sweat and dirt. Richard struggled to carry a cheap television out the front door, his face flushed a dangerous red and his chest heaving, the reality of his advanced age and terrible health finally catching up to him. The sheer suffocating humiliation of their departure was amplified by the vicious reaction of their former elite circle. The sprawling estate was located on a private road shared by the most exclusive members of their country club. As my parents exhaustedly loaded their cheap rental truck, their former friends drove past in their luxury sedans. Not a single person stopped to help them lift a box. Not a single person rolled down a window to offer a word of sympathy. The wealthy neighbors who had eagerly attended Patricia's lavish catered dinner parties now rolled up their tinted windows and locked their doors, staring straight ahead as they drove past the wreckage of the Wilson family. Richard and Patricia had become total social pariahs, completely shunned by the very people they had sacrificed their own daughter to impress. They drove away from the estate in a rattling truck, heading toward a cramped, cheap rental apartment on the desolate outskirts of the city. Their financial and social ruins cemented permanently into the historical record. The dust finally settled on the absolute destruction of the Wilson empire. The people who had ruthlessly tried to bury me were either locked in a federal cell or banished to a life of grueling, unrecognized poverty. The toxic, suffocating weight that had pressed down on my chest for 3 decades was completely gone, leaving nothing but clear, unobstructed air. I stood in the penthouse office of my new corporate headquarters, looking out over the glittering skyline of the city, ready to claim the future I had built with my own 2 hands. The silence inside my corner office was entirely different from the heavy, suffocating quiet that used to blanket the Wilson family estate. This was the pristine, untouchable tranquility of absolute elevation. I stood before the sweeping floor-to-ceiling glass walls of the Apex Holdings penthouse, holding a perfectly brewed espresso in my hands. The ceramic cup radiated a steady, comforting warmth against my palms. Hundreds of feet below, the chaotic, sprawling expanse of the city moved in a relentless, synchronized rhythm. The morning sun reflected off the adjacent steel skyscrapers, casting brilliant golden rays of light across my polished mahogany desk. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the dark, bitter coffee, allowing the rich flavor to ground me completely in the present moment. I was entirely alone, but for the first time in my life, the isolation did not feel like punishment. It felt like an absolute, undeniable victory. The physical and emotional weight that had anchored me to the earth, the relentless, crushing gravity of my parents' impossible expectations, had vanished entirely. I was standing at the absolute summit of the corporate world, completely unburdened by the parasitic demands of the people who shared my bloodline. My gaze drifted to the oversized digital monitor mounted seamlessly onto the far wall of my office. The financial news networks were broadcasting live, and the ticker running continuously across the bottom of the screen displayed the morning market data. The numbers were staggering. Apex Holdings was trading at an unprecedented historic high. The massive, highly publicized dismissal of the frivolous intellectual property lawsuit had sent shockwaves of absolute confidence through the global financial sector. Wall Street despises uncertainty, and the brutal surgical precision with which my legal team had dismantled Bradley's fraudulent claims had instantly solidified my reputation as an utterly formidable, unassailable chief executive. The market had responded to my definitive courtroom victory with a massive surge of enthusiastic capital. Institutional investors who had previously hesitated spooked by the loud, aggressive media campaign my family had orchestrated, were now desperately clamoring to secure equity in my enterprise. The stock valuation had effectively doubled within the span of 48 hours, adding billions to my personal net worth. The very same lawsuit that Richard and Bradley had maliciously designed to completely bankrupt me had inadvertently catapulted my company into the highest, most exclusive echelons of the international technology market. Their malicious greed had been the ultimate catalyst for my absolute triumph. A sharp melodic chime broke the profound stillness of the room. My private encrypted mobile device resting on the corner of my desk, illuminated with a high-priority notification banner. I walked over with unhurried, measured steps, setting my ceramic espresso cup down onto a silver coaster. I picked up the phone and tapped the screen to open the secure message from my chief operating officer. The text was brief, bold, and absolutely monumental. The federal government had officially approved our comprehensive bid. The Department of Defense had formally selected my proprietary logistics software to manage their global supply chain infrastructure, awarding Apex Holdings a massive multi-billion-dollar exclusive federal contract. I stared at the bright, glowing words on the screen, feeling a profound, resonating wave of pure satisfaction wash over me. The action-based backstory of my entire life flashed vividly through my mind. I remembered Richard standing in his study, holding his glass of scotch, explicitly telling me that women did not possess the fundamental analytical capacity to understand complex algorithmic architecture. I remembered Patricia sitting at the country club loudly lamenting to her wealthy friends that her daughter was wasting her youth playing with computers instead of searching for a suitable rich husband. I remembered Bradley taking credit for my earliest software designs, arrogantly claiming that he had to fix my messy code. They had actively conspired to keep me small, to ensure I never outgrew the pathetic, subservient role they had violently forced me into. They had set the bar for my life buried firmly in the dirt, expecting me to simply lie down and accept my place as the family failure. I had not merely defied their toxic expectations, I had absolutely obliterated them. I had built an untouchable technological empire that the United States government now trusted to secure its most critical assets. The phone vibrated in my palm, pulling my attention away from the federal contract confirmation. The screen displayed an incoming call from Cameron. I swiped to answer, bringing the device to my ear. "Good morning, Madam CEO." Cameron said, his voice carrying a distinct, relaxed warmth that was entirely absent during his lethal courtroom performances. "I assume you have seen the incredible news regarding the Department of Defense contract." "I am looking at the confirmation right now, Cameron," I replied, my voice steady and light. "You and the entire legal team did exceptional work finalizing those compliance frameworks." "We simply secured the perimeter, Cassidy," he countered smoothly. "You built the machine that won the war. I am calling to formally request the honor of your presence this evening. The executive board wants to host a private, highly exclusive celebratory dinner at Le Bernardin. We have booked the main dining room. No press, no cameras, no parasites. Just the people who actually helped you build this reality." I smiled, turning back to face the sprawling, sunlit city outside my window. "A celebration sounds absolutely perfect, Cameron," I said. "I will be there at 8. "Excellent," he replied softly. "Enjoy the view today, Cassidy. You earned every single inch of it." The line disconnected with a soft click. I slowly lowered the phone. I was entirely unburdened. The endless cycle of toxic guilt and financial extortion had been violently severed. I was completely unapologetic. I was untouchable. I turned the phone off. I slowly picked up my espresso, taking one final sip, looking out at the vast, limitless horizon of the empire I had built entirely alone.
I used to ride upon your shoulders, thinking you could touch the sky. Every road felt less uncertain when I saw the world through your eyes. You were stronger than the mountains, taller than the northern pines. And when the winter winds were coming, you would stand between them and I. Time kept moving like the river, years slipped slowly out to sea. But no matter where life took me, you were always part of me. I am my Father's daughter, in every step I take, in every time I choose to stand. When it's easier to break, I carry your courage in my heart, your fire inside my soul. And though the years keep moving on, your love still leads me home. You taught me strength is not in power, but in kindness when it's hard. You taught me how to keep on going when the road grows cold and dark. Every lesson, every story, every laugh around the flame lies within me like an echo, calling softly through my name. And when I face my greatest battles, when I feel I can't go on, I can hear your voice beside me saying, child, you're stronger than you know. I am my Father's daughter, in every step I take, in every time I choose to stand. When it's easier to break, I carry your courage in my heart, your fire inside my soul. And though the years keep moving on, your love still leads me home. One day the snow will cover footprints, one day the fire will burn low. But the things a father gives his daughter are the things that never go. Not the gold or not the stories, not the battles that he won, but the quiet way he loved her and the woman she becomes. I am my Father's daughter, and I always will remain. Through every triumph, every loss, through every joy and every pain, the world may change around me, the stars may fade above, but I will always carry with me my Father's endless love. And when they ask me who I am, I'll smile and answer softly.